My name is Joe Webb. I am 74 years old, and I need to tell you something that took me one afternoon to understand. The most dangerous thing a person can do is say the quiet part out loud, because once they say it, you cannot unhear it. And once you cannot unhear it, everything changes. This is that story. My son Richard came to the house on a Saturday in September, and we had lunch at the kitchen table the way we had been having lunch at that table for 30 years. Sandwiches and coffee and the particular comfortable silence of two people who have run out of small talk but who have not yet gotten to the thing they actually came to say. Richard had driven up from Burlington. 2 hours on roads I had driven 10,000 times in 35 years of making farm calls in all weather and all seasons. He arrived at noon. He left at 3. In between, we ate lunch and we talked about his work and about the weather and about the maple tree at the edge of the property that had lost 2 large branches in the last ice storm and that I had been meaning to have looked at. Then, as he was putting on his jacket to leave, he said it. He said, "Dad, this house is going to come to me when you die anyway. It would just be simpler if you transferred it now." I was standing at the kitchen counter. I had my back to him. I was rinsing the coffee cups. I said, "You're right." He said I could set up the paperwork. "It's not complicated." I said, "Let me think about it." He said, "Sure. No rush." He said it the way people say no rush when they mean the opposite. He left at 3. I stood at the kitchen window and watched his car go down the gravel drive and turn onto the county road and disappear behind the tree line. Then I called my attorney. I said, "Margaret, I need to see you Monday morning." She said, "What happened?" I said, "My son told me the house is going to come to him when I die anyway." A pause. She said, "I'll have coffee ready at 8. What Richard did not know, as he drove back to Burlington on a Saturday afternoon in September, was that by Monday afternoon the house on Quarry Road would no longer be going to him when I died. It would not be going to anyone in the way he had assumed. And the process by which that change would eventually reach him would be slower and more thorough and considerably more difficult to reverse than a Saturday lunchtime conversation at a kitchen table. This is the story of what happens when a son mistakes patience for agreement. Who is Joe? My name is Joe Webb. I am 74 years old. I was born in Randolph, Vermont, the son of a dairy farmer who believed that the relationship between a man and his land was the most honest relationship available to him, and that everything else in life was negotiable in ways that land was not. My father farmed the same 200 acres his own father had farmed, and he expected, without ever saying so directly, that I would farm them after him. I did not farm them. I became a veterinarian, which my father considered a reasonable compromise because at least I was still working with animals and because the particular skills I brought to the work, patience and precision and the ability to read a creature that cannot tell you where it hurts, were skills he recognized from his own work and respected. I studied veterinary medicine at the University of Vermont, spent 2 years in a mixed practice in New Hampshire, learning the full range of the work, and returned to central Vermont in 1982 to establish a rural large animal practice that I ran for 35 years out of a converted barn on the Quarry Road property and from the cab of a truck that I put 200,000 miles on over the course of a career that took me to every farm within 40 miles of Randolph. Large animal practice is not glamorous work. It is cold in winter and hot in summer, and it requires the ability to function at 3 in the morning when a heifer is in difficulty and the farmer has been awake since midnight and needs someone who knows what they are doing and who will not panic. It requires patience of a specific kind. The patience of someone who understands that rushing an animal in distress makes the distress worse, and that the only way through most difficult situations is slowly and with complete attention. I was that person for 35 years. I delivered calves in January snowstorms and diagnosed infections in July heat, and set bones and performed surgeries in barns and fields and the backs of trucks in conditions that a city veterinarian would have found unworkable. I did all of it with the steady, unhurried competence of someone who has learned that animals respond to calm, and that calm is something you either bring with you or you don't. Every farmer in the county knew my truck. Most of them had my number memorized. Several of them called me before they called their wives when something went wrong at 2 in the morning, which is the kind of professional trust that takes years to build and that I valued more than any award or credential. I sold the practice 12 years ago to a younger veterinarian named Sarah Park, who had been my associate for 4 years and who was ready to take it over. I sold it at a fair price, and I retired to the house on Quarry Road where I had lived for 31 years and where my wife Helen had lived with me until she passed 8 years ago. Helen passed from a stroke, sudden and final. She was 64 years old, and we had been married for 39 years, and she had been, in every way that mattered, the person who made the house on Quarry Road a home rather than a place to sleep between farm calls. She had kept a garden and raised 2 children and managed the practice's bookkeeping for 20 years and had known every farmer in the county by name and by the particular texture of their difficulties, which is its own form of medicine. The house on Quarry Road is a 4-bedroom farmhouse built in 1887 on 6 acres at the end of a gravel road in the hills above Randolph. Helen and I bought it in 1983 for $68,000, which was everything we had and a little more, and we spent the following 30 years making it the specific kind of home that a house becomes when people who love each other live in it long enough. The house is currently valued at approximately $840,000, which reflects both the renovation work done over the years and the particular appreciation of Vermont rural property in the decade since we bought it. I have 2 children. My daughter Carol lives in Portland, Oregon with her husband and their 3 children and calls every week with the regularity of someone who has internalized the understanding that distance requires more effort, not less. She has Helen's warmth and my stubbornness, and she is, in every practical sense, the child who shows up when showing up matters. My son Richard is 46 years old. He lives in Burlington, where he works in commercial real estate finance, which is to say he spends his professional life understanding what properties are worth and how that value can be structured and transferred and leveraged. He is good at his work. He has been good at his work for 20 years. He came to the house on a Saturday in September and told me, as he was putting on his jacket to leave, that the house was going to come to him when I died anyway. Richard is 46 years old, and he has, in the years since Helen passed, been the child who visits less and calls with the specific purpose of checking in rather than the general purpose of being present, which is a distinction I had noticed without naming until the Saturday in September when the naming became necessary. He had visited 4 times in the year before the September conversation. Each visit had followed the same general pattern: lunch at the kitchen table, a walk around the property, a conversation that covered the condition of the house, the state of my health, my plans for the coming months, and at some point a question or observation about the future of the property that I had understood as concern and that I now understood as assessment. He had asked, on the visit in June, whether I had thought about whether the house was too much for me to maintain alone. I had said the house was manageable and that I had good help from the Kimball boy down the road who handled the heavier outdoor work. He had nodded in the way of someone filing information rather than receiving reassurance. He had asked, on the visit in August, whether I had updated my estate documents since Helen passed. I had said yes. Margaret had updated everything in the year after Helen's death. He had asked whether Margaret was a good estate attorney specifically or more of a general practice attorney. I had said she was thorough and experienced. He had mentioned a name, a firm in Burlington that specialized in estate planning, and suggested they might be worth consulting. I had thanked him and said I was comfortable with Margaret. He had asked, also in August, whether I had considered whether the property might be more sensibly held in a family trust rather than in my name alone. He had framed this as a tax efficiency question. I had said I was comfortable with the current structure. He had said something about stepped-up basis that I had listened to without responding to because I had understood what a stepped-up basis was before Richard was born. Each of these conversations I had received as the practical concern of a son who worked in real estate finance and who naturally thought about property in structural terms. Looking at them together after the September visit, I understood them as a sequence. Each one had moved closer to the Saturday sentence. The June visit had been the opening. The August visits had been the middle. September had been the point. The house is going to come to me when you die anyway. The word anyway was the word I returned to most often in the hours after he left. It contained the assumption. It contained the certainty. It contained the particular confidence of someone who has decided that an outcome is settled and who is now focused on optimizing the timeline. I stood at the kitchen window for a long time after his car disappeared. I looked at Helen's garden, which I had maintained in the 8 years since she passed exactly as she had planted it, because changing it felt like losing something I was not prepared to lose. The dahlias were still in from the summer. The raised beds were ready for their fall planting. Then I called Margaret. What Margaret built. Margaret Chen had been my attorney for 22 years. She had handled the sale of the veterinary practice and had updated my estate documents after Helen's death, and she was, in the ways that mattered, the person I trusted most with the legal dimensions of my life. I drove to her office on Monday morning. I was there at 8. The coffee was ready. I told her about the Saturday conversation, every word of it, in the order it had been said. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she set down her coffee cup and said, "Joe, what do you want to happen with the house?" I said, "I want it to go to Carol." She said, "All of it?" I said, "The house and the land." "Yes," she said. "And Richard?" I said, "Richard will receive his share of the financial estate, the retirement accounts, the savings, the investment portfolio. That is substantial. He will not be left without." She said, "He will feel that the house was taken from him." I said, "He told me the house was already his." "It is not already his. It is mine, and I am going to decide where it goes." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What specifically do you want me to build?" I said, "I want the house in a trust that cannot be challenged. I want Carol as the sole beneficiary of the property trust. I want the reasoning documented clearly, and I want Richard to understand, when the time comes, that this was not a sudden decision made in anger, but a considered decision made in response to something he said." She said, "You want him to know about the Saturday conversation." I said, "I want the letter of instruction to quote it directly." Margaret said, "That is unusual." I said, "Yes," she said. "It will make the conversation harder when it happens." I said, "The conversation is already hard. I am simply making sure it is accurate." Margaret worked for 2 weeks. What she built was thorough. The Webb Family Property Trust was established with me as trustee for life and Carol as successor trustee and sole beneficiary. The trust contained specific provisions protecting the property from any legal challenge and specified that the property was to be maintained as a residential property and not developed or subdivided for a period of 20 years following my death. The letter of instruction that accompanied the trust documentation was 4 pages. It described, in my own words and in precise chronological order, the 4 visits Richard had made in the year before September, the questions he had asked during each visit, and the specific words he had used on the Saturday in September when he told me the house was going to come to him when I died anyway. It described my response and what I had done on the Monday following. It described my reasoning, which was not that Richard had done something unforgivable, but that he had revealed, in one unguarded sentence, an assumption about my property and my intentions that I had not authorized, and that I was not willing to allow to stand uncorrected. The letter ended with 1 paragraph that I had written myself without Margaret's assistance. It said, "A house is not an inheritance until the person who owns it decides to make it one. I built this life on this land with Helen for 39 years. Where it goes when I am gone is my decision and Helen's memory. It is not a given. It was never a given." Margaret reviewed the documents 4 times. I read every page twice. I signed on a Wednesday afternoon with Margaret's notary present. On the way home, I stopped at the farm supply store and bought the bulbs for Helen's fall garden planting. I planted them that evening. Richard called every 2 weeks through the fall and winter and into the following spring, the same interval he had maintained for years, and the calls were the same calls they had always been, brief and practical and focused on the specific topics he brought to them. He did not raise the subject of the house again. I do not know whether this was because he believed the matter had been discussed and was moving toward the resolution he expected, or because he sensed something in my response on the Saturday that he was not ready to examine. I did not raise the subject either. I answered his questions about my health and the property honestly and without elaboration, and I waited. Carol called every Sunday. I told her about the trust in November, 3 months after the Saturday conversation. I told her everything, the full sequence from the June visit to the Wednesday signing, and I told her what the trust contained and why. She was quiet for a long moment. She said, "Dad, are you sure?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Richard is going to be very upset." I said, "I know." She said, "This is going to change things between you." I said, "Things changed on a Saturday in September. I am responding to what changed." She said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "Nothing right now. When the time comes, I will need you to be steady." She said, "I can do that." I said, "I know you can. You get that from your mother." I told Richard on a Sunday afternoon in April, 7 months after the Saturday conversation. I had invited him to lunch, as I had done many times, and he had come up from Burlington with the easy expectation of someone who believes the afternoon will unfold in the familiar way of all the other Sunday afternoons. We ate. We talked. After lunch, I asked him to sit back down at the table. I placed 2 documents on the table. The first was the Webb Family Property Trust, the cover page, and the summary of its provisions. I did not give him the full document. I gave him enough to understand what it said. The second was the letter of instruction, all 4 pages. I said, "Richard, I want you to read these before we talk." He picked up the trust document first. He read the first page with the focused attention of someone who works with property documents professionally and who understands immediately what he is reading. He read the second page more slowly. He set it down. He picked up the letter of instruction. He read the first page. He read the second page. On the third page, where I had quoted his words directly, he stopped. He looked up at me. He said, "You wrote down what I said." I said, "Yes." He said, "Word for word." I said, as precisely as I could recall it. He said, "Dad." I said, "Let me say what I need to say, and then you can say whatever you need to say." He was quiet. I said, "Richard, you told me in September that this house was going to come to you when I died anyway. I have thought about that sentence every day for 7 months. Not because it made me angry, though it did make me angry, because of the word anyway. That word told me something about how you have been thinking about this house, and about me, and about what my life here means." He said, "I didn't mean it the way it sounded." I said, "I know you didn't mean it to sound the way it sounded, but I need you to understand what it sounded like to me. It sounded like you had already decided. Like the house was already yours in some practical sense, and the only remaining question was timing, and that is not something I had agreed to." He said, "I've been thinking about your future, about what happens if you need more care, about whether this property is manageable long term." I said, "Those are legitimate concerns. They could have been raised as questions. They were not raised as questions." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Is Carol getting the house?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Because of one sentence." I said, "Because of a pattern that one sentence made clear. The June visit and the August visits and the questions you asked, and then the September sentence." I saw the pattern when it completed itself. He said, "That's not fair." I said, "Richard, fairness is not the question I was answering. The question I was answering was where this house should go when I die. Your sister has never once in 8 years since your mother passed suggested to me that she knew the answer to that question. You told me the answer on a Saturday in September as you were putting on your jacket. He looked at the documents on the table. He said, "What do I get?" I said, "The retirement accounts, the savings, the investment portfolio, everything except the property. That is substantial. You are not being left without." He said, "Mom would have wanted the house to stay in the family." I said, "The house is staying in the family. It is going to your sister." He said, "That's not what I meant." I said, "I know what you meant. And I want you to know that your mother and I discussed this house many times in 39 years, and she never once said it should go to one child over the other. What she said consistently was that it should go to the child who understood what it was, not what it was worth." What it was. He was quiet for a long time. I said, "I am not done with this house, Richard. I am not done with this life. I will be here for as long as I am able to be here, and when I am no longer able, this house will go to Carol and she will decide what it means for her. That is how it should work, not with an anyway." He stood up. He picked up his jacket. He did not take the documents. He said, "I need some time." I said, "Take what you need." He left. I watched his car go down the gravel drive and turn onto the county road. The same view as September. Different afternoon. I went out to Helen's garden. The fall bulbs had come through well. The dahlias I had planted in October were beginning to show. Everything exactly where she had put it. 8 years later, still coming back. Richard did not call for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of silence that I spent in the way I had spent difficult periods throughout my professional life, which is to say, doing the work in front of me, and not forcing the resolution of things that required their own time to resolve. When he called, he was quieter than I had heard him in a long time, the particular quiet of someone who has been somewhere difficult and has not fully returned from it. He said, "Dad, I want to understand what I did wrong." I said, You assumed out loud." He said, "I've been thinking about the word anyway for 6 weeks." I said, "Good," he said. "I think I've been thinking about the house as mine for longer than September, since Mom died." "Maybe longer than that," I said. "I know." He said, "I told myself it was practical thinking, planning. I work in real estate. I think about property all day. I told myself I was just being organized about the future." I said, "There is a difference between thinking practically about the future and telling someone that their property is already yours." He said, "I know that now." He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know you are." He said, "Is it too late to change it?" I said, "The trust is established and I am comfortable with what it says. What I am open to is a conversation about what your relationship with this house looks like while I am alive. You are welcome here. You have always been welcome here. Nothing about the trust changes that." He said, "That's not the same." I said, "No, it isn't. And I want you to sit with the difference between those two things, rather than trying to resolve it quickly. The difference matters." He was quiet for a long time. He said, "Can I come up next weekend?" I said, "Yes, come for lunch." He came on a Saturday in May. We ate sandwiches at the kitchen table the way we had always eaten sandwiches at the kitchen table, the same table where he had told me the house was going to come to him anyway and where I had said, "You're right," without meaning it. We walked the property in the afternoon. We looked at the maple that the arborist had said was structurally sound despite the lost branches, which I had taken as confirmation of something I already believed about trees that have been in the same ground for a long time. We did not talk about the trust. We talked about his work and about Carol's children and about the spring planting and about the particular quality of a Vermont May, when the mud is cleared and the light has come back and everything that was dormant has decided to try again. He helped me plant the new section of Helen's garden that I had been expanding along the south fence. He was not a practiced gardener, but he was willing, and he listened to what I told him about spacing and depth. and he worked with the particular careful attention of someone doing unfamiliar work in the presence of someone for whom the work is familiar. He stayed for dinner. He had not stayed for dinner in 2 years. Helen would have liked that he stayed. Carol called the following Sunday. I told her Richard had come. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How was it?" I said, "He helped plant the garden." She said, "Mom would have liked that." I said, "Yes, she would have. I am 74 years old. I spent 35 years working with animals that could not tell me where they hurt, and that required me to read the signs they gave me accurately and respond to what the signs actually indicated rather than what I hoped they still indicated. That is the essential skill of the work, not technical knowledge, though technical knowledge matters. The reading, the willingness to see what is there rather than what you want to see. Richard told me something on a Saturday in September that I read carefully. The reading told me something I did not want to know. I responded to what it actually indicated rather than to what I preferred it to mean. That is not a comfortable way to live. It is an honest one. What I want to say to any person who has heard something from someone they love that changed what they understood about that person is this: you heard it. You cannot unhear it. And you are not required to act as though you did not hear it, simply because acting on what you heard is difficult. The house on Quarry Road is mine. It will be Carol's when I am gone. Helen's garden is coming back for the 9th spring in a row. The dahlias are in. The new section along the south fence is taken well. Richard planted some of it. That means something. I am not sure yet exactly what it will grow into, but it means something, and I am paying attention to what it means in the way I have always paid attention to the signs that things give me when I am willing to look at them honestly. A heifer that is beginning to trust you gives you a sign. A field that is recovering from a hard winter gives you a sign. A son who stays for dinner after 6 weeks of silence and helps plant his mother's garden gives you a sign. I am reading the sign. I will give it the time it needs. The best move is the one they never saw coming. Tell me in the comments, has someone ever said something to you that changed everything about how you saw them? I want to hear from you.